You've heard a lot about why the failure of the Republicans to repeal and replace Obamacare is going to hurt them in their attempts to pass tax reform. And the reason is this. The Republicans do not have a supermajority in the Senate, so the filibuster is still available to Democrats. In the House, Democrats can slow down bills by adding amendments to them, which ultimately get rejected, but it slows down the workings of the bill and can be very complicated because amendments could be put on there that make it very difficult for Republicans to vote against. There is a parliamentary maneuver called trying to pass something through reconciliation. But there are very specific rules about reconciliation. The benefits of reconciliation to the majority party is in the Senate, it is filibuster proof. You only need a 51 vote majority to pass it, which the Republicans have. In the House, a reconciliation bill cannot be amended. But there are some restrictions on the reconciliation bill. It must start in the House. Now, there's ways of getting around this. Sometimes the Senate will pass some rinky-dink tax bill that nobody really wants, and it comes to the House, and they rejigger it, and it goes back. But mostly it must start in the House. It must impact the federal budget. So you can't get rid of, let's say, the Obamacare regulations on the quality of your health insurance through this process, because to the extent that it impacts the budget, it's ancillary. It's not directly affecting the spending of the U.S. government. On top of this, this is where they start getting into problems. A reconciliation bill cannot add to the deficit in year 11 and on of the U.S. ledger, essentially. So the idea with passing health care first, or repeal of health care, was that it was going to provide a massive $800 billion tax cut, almost $1 trillion. It was $860 billion. $1 trillion tax cut, most of which would have gone to the top 1 or 2% of the population. And simultaneously, it would have cut nearly $1 trillion from the budget because you're getting rid of health care for a lot of people for a long time. And so the idea was that they were going to get that big tax cut. And then they would come in and do this next round of tax cuts, which would have added to the top 1 or 2%, but also could have been spread around. And they could find maybe $1 trillion worth of cuts. A little bit here, a little bit there. Maybe we'll add a border tax that will make up, and we'll get basically to net zero, and we can pass this thing through reconciliation. Well, they can't do that now because they just lost $1 trillion worth of savings and $1 trillion worth of tax cuts. So the question is how are they going to cut more taxes? Well, it turns out that the border tax is not going over very well with folks like Walmart. And that impacts a lot of Republicans. And it also turns out that all the tax savings, the tax loopholes that they could reverse, they basically all go to people at the top. And so it's hard to find savings on the backs of people that the poor people that they would have, if they had cut Medicare. Because the rich people's Medicaid, I should say, the rich people's Medicaid is something called the mortgage interest deduction. And nobody wants to get rid of that. I should say, nobody who's not, nobody in the Republican coalition wants to get rid of that because it's necessarily goes to people who have a lot of money. Or I should say, people who have a lot of money necessarily want to keep that tax cut. The other problem that they have here is, of course, is the sunsetting. If they had repealed Obamacare, you were talking about a permanent tax cut that could last for decades and decades because it would have been paid for by the fact that we're not providing health care for people. Now, the only tax cut they can pass is one that will expire in 10 years. And you'll recall, we went through this with Bush. There were tax cuts in 2001, late 2001, early 2002, I think it was, which expired in 2011. Does everybody remember the fiscal cliff? Well, in fact, it wasn't a fiscal cliff. It was just the idea that these tax cuts would expire, and the Republicans were upset about it. So when they do this again, because they're going to do it again, they're going to cut taxes for wealthy people for 10 years. 10 years later, folks, let's just keep in mind that we don't need to do anything and they expire. It won't be framed that way, just like it wasn't framed that way 6 years ago. It was framed like it was a crisis. But President Obama could have done nothing and would have won. Literally done nothing. Just said, I'm going golfing. I'll be in Hawaii. Sorry. It's Ramadan. Can't make it.
Not you, too.
I'm just saying that they would have said, well, in that case. So this is going to be a real problem. And the corporate tax reform that they want, here's the dirty little secret. You know how we supposedly have the highest tax rates in the Western world? Well, you'll see when they can't pass a corporate tax reform bill that corporations, despite the fact that we have the highest tax rate in the Western world for corporations, the effective tax is somewhere down in the 75th or 60th percentile. And all of the tax loopholes that would be removed in the event that we drop the rate would impact negatively these corporations more than the supposed tax they're paying now. So my prediction is what we're ultimately going to see, and maybe we won't even see this. I mean, this is what Chuck Schumer and Paul Ryan and Hillary Clinton were hoping they would get, which would have been a tax repatriation of money that is kept offshore by corporations. Remember, during the Eisenhower administration said to corporations, look, instead of having to pay taxes on money that you make overseas, we've just blown up the whole world fighting the Nazis, and we want to build up foreign markets. So here's the deal. I'm going to give you a moratorium. You will not have to pay taxes until you bring that money back to the U.S. That way you can keep the money over there and reinvest it and continue to build your businesses in foreign countries. Now, 40, 50, 60 years later now, 70 years later almost, it is as if this is a huge burden on U.S. corporations to have to pay these taxes when they come back into the country. So in 2005, George Bush hailed the America Jobs Creation Act, which supposedly was going to create a bunch of jobs. People like HP were pushing this. So they said, one time only, you get to bring these taxes back at like 3%. Maybe it was 3.5% tax rate. The money came back. Shareholders got huge dividends. They were used for stock buybacks. So the board of directors and the CEOs got paid off. I think HP laid off 15,000 people that year, among other companies. You can Google it. And I have a feeling we're going to see something like that again. The only possible difference, the only way they'll get Democrats on board, I think, this was the plan before the election, was to earmark some of that money to infrastructure build out. So and my guess will be it'll be something even worse than that. They'll be able to bring the money back and they'll get some type of sweetheart bond if they apply the money to a road they get to privatize. I mean, that, obviously it's not just going to be roads, but if the money is spent on some type of infrastructure. So they'll end up paying no taxes on this. It'll just basically be a huge giveaway. But the broad-based tax reform, long-term tax reform that they want to accomplish, I think is going to be very, very difficult for them to pull off at this point. But at one point, Donald Trump will realize like he needs a win because he can't just keep losing and losing and losing. And that's assuming he is still in office. Hey folks, Sam Seder here. Donald Trump can kiss all of our asses. And one way he can is by you subscribing to this channel. I don't know how that works.